So welcome to LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I've got about 30 clips on a bunch of different topics, what I think should be a really good show tonight. As always, this is my weekly broadcast of the best clips from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the corporate media here in the United States, along with my commentary between the clips and along with at least one quasi-news political comedy clip this week that I like to add into the mix. HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher was off this week, but I do have a clip from Saturday Night Live I'm going to start off with in just a minute. As always, I'll be using clips from all the Sunday morning news analysis shows on the regular Big Five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News. The topics I'll be covering this week include a follow-up on the Islam issue and whether liberals are too tolerant of Islam with a clip from Sam Harris on CNN's Reliable Sources. I'll have a bunch of clips on the first Ebola case caught in the United States by a Texas healthcare worker and some more about the Ebola outbreak in Africa. There'll be about the same number of clips on the ISIS threat, the bombing in Iraq and Syria and the debate that's continuing. But I want to start with Supreme Court inaction this last week that allowed gay marriage to be legal in about 35 U.S. states. And I'm going to show some clips from Fox News Sunday taking that issue seriously. But first I want to show Michael Che from Saturday Night Live's Weekend Update last night discussing this issue over in this clip.
After the Supreme Court declined a rule on the issue of same-sex marriage, it is now legal in 30 states. I'm happy for same-sex couples, but I feel bad for a group of people that still get ignored in this country, and that's gay dudes who really don't want to get married and had a really good excuse not to for so long. I know there's some deadbeat gay boyfriends out there like, yo, Carl, you know I want to marry you. But society, man, just won't let us. Oh, well, I guess we gotta just keep boning casually till the world gets its act together.
So there you can see someone trying to make a rational argument that there actually are victims from the growing marriage equality movement. But, you know, it's kind of a joke. There's not really anyone who's hurt by allowing equality and allowing same-sex couples to get married. But over on Fox News Sunday this morning, they had a debate between Tony Perkins of Focus on the Family, who's this right-wing Christian guy who has made a lot of inflammatory statements about gay marriage, and he was up against a conservative lawyer, Ted Olson, who was part of this conservative liberal team that argued in favor of marriage equality before the Supreme Court last year. And they were the same lawyers that argued on opposite sides in Bush v. Gore in the Supreme Court in 2000. And so I wanted to show you a couple clips of that. First, here's Tony Perkins trying to use the most inflammatory language possible to smear marriage equality over in this clip.
Ted is more of an expert on the Supreme Court. You still have two circuits that have decisions coming up that look favorable toward natural marriage. But I think the effect here is what you need to look at. I think the effect of this is the court did a back alley type Roe v. Wade judicial decision by letting the lower courts do their evil bidding. And the result of that is such, you go back to 1973 when the court imposed abortion on the nation. It was to resolve the issue. 41 years later, that issue is now a political issue in every election from president on down. This issue is not going away despite what the court may say.
So yeah, I thought that was calling it back alley and doing the evil bidding. He was trying to use the most negative language that he possibly could come up with there, I guess. But and I'll show it gets a little worse later. But first I want to show a clip of Ted Olson, the conservative or Republican lawyer who's argued in favor of marriage equality, answering a question from Chris Wallace about judicial activism, where he actually plays a clip from Senator Ted Cruz, who came out angrily against this latest inaction by the Supreme Court, where they, by denying cert and not reviewing cases from all these circuits that struck down bans on gay marriage. They're allowing marriages to take place, like I said, in about 35 U.S. states. And here's how Ted Olson responded to the claim that that's judicial activism with a clip from Ted Cruz presented by Chris Wallace on Fox News Sunday this morning here.
People have about all this. In all 16 of the states that, because of the Supreme Court's non-decision, may now have legal same-sex marriage, there was a ban on those same-sex marriage, either approved by the state legislature or popular referendum. Mr. Olson, you have a long record of opposing what you call, or people call, judicial activism. Here's what Senator Ted Cruz said this week. Take a look.
We shouldn't have unelected judges striking down our marriage laws, trying to impose their public policy notion on the state of Texas and on states where the elected legislatures have made the decision to preserve and protect traditional marriage.
Question: why should judges overrule the demonstrated will of the people, either through referenda or through state legislative action?
We have a Constitution and a Bill of Rights precisely because we want protections from majority rule. When the majority in a legislature or a popular vote take away rights of individuals that are protected by the Bill of Rights, then we have an independent judiciary to rectify that situation. It's happened again and again and again throughout this country's history. We have an independent judiciary to protect the rights of individuals like gay and lesbian citizens who only want respect, decency, and equality along with the rest of us.
Mr.
So that's a really good refutation of the claim that this is judicial activism, that we're striking down laws passed by majorities or passed by the legislatures. And, you know, because you can use the same argument for any law that's struck down in order to protect the rights of minorities or against the rule of the majority, which is one of the basic parts of liberal democracy. So that was a good answer, but Tony Perkins did not have that great an answer when he was trying to figure out who's hurt by allowing marriage equality to same-sex couples. And you can see he even denies something that he said in the past where, you know, a lot of opponents of marriage equality, when they try to talk about what are the boundaries, they try to talk about, you know, man versus man marrying man marrying, you know, groups of people, and even like man on dog. I remember that was like the famous thing from Rick Santorum a while back. And so Chris Wallace actually raises, are we talking about marrying pets? And which he denies, but he still can't come up with a good reason why marriage equality is hurting someone, as you can see over in this clip. And then it's followed by Ted Olson making another great refutation, as I'll talk about after you see it here.
But let me ask you, what are the boundaries, though? If it's just love, what are the boundaries? Where can we go with marriage?
What are you suggesting? That they're going to be polygamy? That people will be marrying their pets?
No, I didn't say that. If we remove the natural established boundaries for marriage, the union of a man and a woman, we've removed those boundaries, those guardrails. There is no arbitrary boundary that Ted Olson makes,
which he said, all right, you and your wife live happily in this house. There's a same-sex couple living here. What's the damage to you?
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the wedding vendors that have been put out of business. Let's talk
I'm not talking about that. It's a different issue.
It's
a different issue. It's a different issue. I'm asking you, what's the impact on you and your family to have these people living next door?
Let's talk about it. Let's talk about my children. All of a sudden, in school, are taught values and morals that contradict what I teach as a parent at home. That's happening already across the country in those states that have recognized and forced same-sex marriage on the states. But let's talk about the business place. Let's talk about Aaron and Melissa Klein, a bakery in Oregon, forced out of business, forced to pay $150,000 in fines simply because they didn't want to participate in a same-sex wedding.
We're going to get to that in a second, but your argument as to whether somehow this damages the Perkins to have another couple next door.
Well, everyone who's ever talked about this says that there's no heterosexual couple that is going to decide to get divorced or not to get married or not to raise children just because another couple next to them is treated equally and with respect and decency under our Constitution. That is why we have courts. The same argument Mr. Perkins was making was made with respect to interracial marriages in 1967. 30-some states at one point prohibited interracial marriages. And talk about the color of the skin. People were making the same argument arguments. Marriage is wrong between people of different races. We have to stop that. When the Supreme Court finally acted, 16 states were still prohibiting interracial marriages. As far as the marriage vendors, the people in the flower business or in the cake business or whatever it happens to be, we have civil rights laws that say if you're going to engage in commerce, you're not going to discriminate against people on the basis of their religion, of their sex, or their race. That's a simple solution to the problem. Massachusetts allowed same.
So yeah, I thought Ted Olson's refutation there was much stronger than Tony Perkins' attempt to come up with what the harms are from allowing marriage equality, especially what Ted Olson was saying there about those same arguments having been used against miscegenation, interracial marriage, that allowing it also teaches values in our schools, that it's right, and how are we going to protect our children from values that we don't agree with, and it's all just fear and bigotry trying to be disguised as religious rights. And speaking of that question there where Chris Wallace, as I mentioned, said, are you talking about marrying pets? And Tony Perkins denied it. Another piece of political comedy I saw this morning was over on Twitter. I guess Liz Winstead, who helped create The Daily Show and is this great comedian, she tweeted, apparently having watched that same interview. Here, I'll put the tweet up. I swear Tony Perkins thinks about marrying his dog every day. And then she put a link up to basically the full argument between Ted Olson and Tony Perkins and Chris Wallace that I showed. And by the way, down in the video description, I put a link to all the sources, at least when they're available, of all the clips that I showed. I think I have sources of every clip available down in the video description if you want to see the full content rather than just the clips I've chosen for you. And anyway, also speaking of bigotry and dressed up as religion or bigotry against religion, I want to talk a little bit about the issue of Islam that has been a big popular topic in my Liberal Viewer Sunday live clip roundup shows the last couple weeks, based on some clips from HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher. I don't have any clips of from that show this week because he didn't broadcast. He was off this week, although he's going to be back next Friday. But I did see an interesting discussion between Sam Harris, who was on the show last week, and also this atheist, or at least liberal Muslim, Irshad Manji, and they talked about some of those issues. And one of the first points I want to show is how Irshad Manji was trying to get Sam Harris to focus more on the reform that's going on in Islam and not only focus on the extremists. And Sam Harris, sort of agrees with that point, and then he takes this slam at Reza Eslan. I don't quite understand, but I'll talk about that a little more after I show you that clip here.
Good folks like you, and you are coming from an absolutely constructive place in my view. Good folks like you will say that you want to help empower Muslim reformists, but then will almost exclusively focus on the jihadis and the extremists when you're in front of a TV camera or a radio microphone. I don't understand why you consistently lapse into that mistake.
Reformists have to focus on the extremists and the jihadists and the Islamists as well. This is a common project.
But they're saying we're here and we're speaking. Why aren't you listening?
That's why I'm talking to you, Irshad, and that's why I'm not talking to Reza Aslan. I consider that this is a fundamental distinction. We need people who will honestly acknowledge the problem. And this is why I'm doing a book with Majid Nawaz, and this is why I'm giving money to his organization.
And I don't know, kind of that Sam Harris distinction between people he will talk to and who he won't talk to, and the people he won't talk to includes Reza Eslan, and he also, you'll see in the clip I show at the end, slams Glenn Greenwald, who's someone who I don't always agree with, but whose work I really respect, and so that kind of makes me a little skeptical. And I want to show Brian Stelter, the host of CNN's Reliable Sources, challenges Sam Harris to give the source of these stats that he used on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, that 20% of Muslims are radical Muslims. And you'll see first Sam Harris dodges the question. He says, instead of giving the sources, he says, they're conservative estimates. And then you'll see that Brian Stetler actually brings up specific Pew Research Center statistics that I'll talk about a little more if you see that clip here.
Your point, Sam, about these percentages, you said on the Bill Maher program that jihadists and Islamists make up arguably 20% of Muslims in the world. But I can't find the data for that. Where does that come from?
Well, that's quite conservative, and again,
but it's conservative based on what?
Well, Pew results, Gallup polls. There have been many polls done in Muslim countries, and if you look at these polls, you'll see that in many cases the most extreme countries have not allowed the polling to take place. So the data already skewed in favor of a more benign picture.
Well, that's a fair point, but the same Pew polls that you're citing also show things like this. Let me read one line from it. This is from 2013. In most countries where the survey asked Muslims about religious extremism, more than 75% say suicide bombing and other forms of violence against civilians is rarely or never justified. To me, that doesn't sound like the sort of violent Islam that I hear you describing.
Okay, well, you've cherry-picked one question, but just flip it around. So 25% say that it is sometimes or often justified, and when you look, that's averaged over a bunch of countries.
That's
if you
right.
look at specific countries, there are percentages that are much higher.
So then I guess we should be having a country-by-country discussion and not a discussion about Islam.
Well, no, we can do that, but again, it's misleading to focus on countries, as many people want to do, and it's much more relevant to focus on doctrines and the total number of subscribers to each of these doctrines. So if you ask a question like, do you think apostates should be killed? Do you think someone should be killed for leaving the religion, whether joining another religion or becoming an atheist? That is, first of all, that is a mainstream doctrine within Islam. There is no school of Islam that says, "Oh no, apostasy is fine. Where did you ever get that idea?" Every school of jurisprudence in the Muslim world will say that apostasy is a killing offense. Now, a reformist like Irshad has to figure out how to change that.
But Sam,
if you take this narrow question,
may I just add
vast numbers of Muslims believe this is a killing offense, and that's why Irshad's life is dangerous, and that's why the life of any Muslim atheist is dangerous in the way that the life of a Christian atheist or a Jewish atheist isn't.
Irshad, do you feel that your life is dangerous?
Used to be. I don't feel that much anymore, in part because I think things have radically changed, and they have in the trenches since 9/11. Not for everybody, but I can tell you not long ago, I did a major debate on Al Jazeera in which I was debating a conservative Muslim. Sure, I received hate mail afterwards, but I got a lot more love bombs from a new generation of Muslims than I did hate mail, and not a single death threat. Am I therefore saying that everything is rosy? Not at all. And please do not misunderstand me there. What I am saying is that when you consistently focus on the problem without shining a light, Sam, on where the hope is coming from, then that in turn misleads the general public into believing that there simply is no hope. And so people lapse into despair and then become even more angry and even more fearful.
And I think that last part is a really important point, where if you put this smear on the entire religion of Islam, and then there are these people who are actually reformists within Islam, they also get smeared, and that discourages them and focuses hatred on them that they don't deserve, because they're actually the people who we want to promote that she's talking about. Although she wasn't really the best proponent of the anti-Sam Harris side, I guess. Like I said, he didn't want to appear with Reza Eslan, and then in this, well, first, before I get to that clip, I want to show, this is that, this is that Pew Research Center poll that CNN's Reliable Sources put up there. I thought it kind of flashed really quick and I couldn't see it. I mean, those percentages are still pretty high, you know, that, of course, these are the reverse ones, but the like 32% of the people in Egypt think that it's sometimes or often okay for suicide bombing in defense of Islam. That's kind of high. But then again, I've seen a lot of polls in the United States that have 32% of Americans believing really crazy things. So I don't want to put too much stock in what the 32% believe. And then the last clip I want to show you from that CNN Reliable Sources segment with Sam Harris and Irshad Manji. This is one where Sam Harris really like cuts into Glenn Greenwald and Reza Aslan again and calls them, I think, obscurists. I can't remember the exact word. It's not a word I'm used to using, but I'll talk about that a little more, and about how Glenn Greenwald has attacked Sam Harris after you see that final clip here.
The other thing that you notice about my focus is a result of the fact that so few people are calling a spade on this issue. We have a president who says ISIS has nothing to do with Islam.
Right.
We have obscurantists like Glenn Greenwald and Reza Aslan taking up immense bandwidth,
right.
and lying about the link between doctrine and behavior. And then academics and journalists everywhere simply don't believe that anyone ever believes in paradise. I think this is all propaganda. I think
course
they're all. They think jihadists are bluffing.
My point.
It's amazing to me that blowing yourself up is not convincing as a rhetorical device that you actually have the courage of your convictions.
Sam, I'm simply saying I agree with you 100% on that, and I'm simply saying that rather than allow yourself to be distracted by the propagandists, how about taking back your message and shining a spotlight on reformists over and over again, not just once, not just intermittently.
So you can see, like I said, Irshad Manji didn't spend a lot of time contradicting anything that Sam Harris was saying there. But if you want to see someone who does spend a lot of time contradicting what Sam Harris said, I put a link down in the video description to a long article by Glenn Greenwald that also links to emails he had back and forth with Sam Harris that is really a devastating critique, I think. Here's just one paragraph from that article in The Guardian. It talks about Sam Harris's critique not being a critique of religion generally. It's a relentless effort to depict Islam as the supreme threat. And as I pointed out in my previous arguments, there are really nasty militaristic things in the Quran, and there are also positive, humanistic, respecting the dignity and giving everyone respect and dignity type of passages as well. And that's the same is true in Judaism and Christianity, but based on the view that Islam is such a threat, you can see Glenn Greenwald talking about the way Sam Harris has used this to have like a really like neocon militaristic view of what policy in the Middle East should be. All civilized nations must unite in condemnation of a theology that now threatens to destabilize much of the earth. And anyway, and there's a lot more. Like I said, that's just one paragraph from a really long article by Glenn Greenwald that also links to emails that he exchanged with Sam Harris that give a really long critique of the smear on the religion of Islam. And I got a lot of responses to my last video saying, they're not criticizing all Muslims, they're criticizing Islam. Well, my point is, you can't criticize all of Islam by even if it is 23 or 32% of Muslims believing that suicide bombing is okay. If there's another like 32% of people who read the same book and turn out to be progressive liberal Muslims, that means the problem isn't in the book, it's in the readers. And so you can't smear all of Islam because there's like you can pull nasty doctrines out of it, and you can pull really good positive humanistic doctrines out of it, just like you can with the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible. There's a large diversity of views from people who read that book and call themselves Muslims. That's my point. And smearing the entire religion as somehow evil is not fair unless you're someone who is pointing to the fact that all religions are based on irrationality. And that is a fair point. And like I said, I've talked about this in my video I think it was called Jon Stewart Bigger Than Jesus, ? Stephen Colbert and Ayaan Hirsi Ali discuss rationality and religion, and I'll put a link to that. I didn't before the show, but I'll put a link to that if you're watching this as a recorded show. And anyway, I just wanted to make that point one more time, because I've gotten a lot of negative feedback from some part of my audience and positive feedback from others, and I just wanted to try to make the argument for a third time and see if I did it a little bit better. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. You can let me know what you think down in the comment section. I want to move on to the next topic. The big breaking news about the Ebola outbreak in the United States has moved to the first transmission within the United States between this guy, Thomas Eric Duncan, who unfortunately died this last week, came over from Liberia and then got sick with Ebola in Dallas, Texas. Apparently a healthcare worker, a female nurse, based on all the clips or all the shows I viewed this morning. They haven't really released much information about the person, but this female nurse contacted it even though she was wearing, like a plastic shield and gloves and all this protocol measures she was supposed to take. First, I'm going to start with the head of the Centers for Disease Control, Dr. Tom Frieden, announcing that it's from a breach of protocol, but they don't know the breach of protocol, which I'll talk about a little more if you see that clip here.
For the CDC, Thomas Friedman speaking now.
A worker in Texas has tested preliminarily positive for infection with Ebola virus. Confirmatory testing is underway at CDC and will be completed later today. We don't know what occurred in the care of the index patient, the original patient in Dallas, but at some point there was a breach in protocol, and that breach in protocol resulted in this infection.
So I think that there's kind of a contradiction scientifically in what Dr. Tom Frieden said there, and I'm going to show a bunch of clips on that. The contradiction is they don't know what the breach of protocol is, but they know that this transmission comes from a breach in the protocols from this healthcare worker. But first I want to show, here's a clip of Tom Frieden from that same news conference warning that there could be a greater spread of Ebola because of this transmission, and then talking generally about what their plan is to fight the outbreak over in this clip.
First is that, unfortunately, it is possible in the coming days that we will see additional cases of Ebola. This is because the healthcare workers who cared for this individual may have had a breach of the same nature of the individual who appears now to have a preliminary positive test. That risk is in the 48 people who are being monitored, all of whom have been tested daily, none of whom so far have developed symptoms or fever, and in any other healthcare workers who may have been exposed to this index patient while he was being cared for. We're still determining how many healthcare workers that will be. That is an intensive investigation. It takes many hours of tracing steps. We'll always cast the net wider. There, though, is no risk to people outside of that circle of the healthcare workers who cared for the individual patient and the initial 48 patients or contacts who had definite or possible contact with the index patient who we've already identified. The second point I want to make is that what we do to stop Ebola is to break the links of transmission, to break the chains of transmission. And we do that by making sure that every person with Ebola is promptly diagnosed, that they're promptly isolated, that we identify their contacts, and that we actively monitor their contacts every day for 21 days. And if they develop symptoms or fever, we do the same process again. That's how we have stopped every Ebola outbreak in history except the one currently in West Africa. That's how we stopped it in Lagos, Nigeria. That's how we will stop it in Dallas. So breaking the links in the chain of transmission is the key to preventing further spread.
Okay, so I mean that's obviously going to be true. Breaking the chain of transmission is how you stop the spread of Ebola. But the thing is, how do they know that the person who got Ebola this time got it because she broke protocol, that she did something wrong with her gloves or her mask? They talked about, you have to be really careful taking it off, that you don't contaminate yourself in that process. But the thing is, they're sure that it was a breach of protocol that caused this infection, but they don't know what the breach is yet. That was actually confirmed by this Atlanta reporter, Steve Gelbach, asking a question during that same press conference over in this clip.
Steve Gelbach from WSB TV in Atlanta. This healthcare worker, you said multiple contacts with the original patient. In your interviews with her, has she been able to specifically isolate a chance where this may have occurred, where this breach, you say, in those interviews with her, talking about why you're specifically investigating maybe where she's taking off the equipment or anything, why you're focusing on that part in your investigation?
We have spoken with the healthcare worker, and that individual has not been able to identify a specific breach. The way we do investigations like this is we look at every single interaction, what was the nature of that interaction. We look at any other information we can gather. I was not mentioning the taking on or off PPE or the procedures related to the investigation, but as a general rule, these are the two areas where we see the greatest risk.
So yeah, I'm kind of concerned that they keep saying that this new infection resulted from a breach in protocol. They may be saying that to keep us all calm, when scientifically you can't start with that conclusion in an investigation when you so far haven't found out in the investigation what the specific breach was. Now, of course, it's obviously the most likely explanation, but I mean, you could theorize, all these really weird, unlikely explanations. Like maybe she had some contact with the guy before he came into the hospital in Dallas somewhere. Never told anyone about it. Or, maybe the virus is mutated so it goes through plastic now. And I mean, that's really low probability. And I'm going to show a clip a little bit where a CBS chief medical correspondent or analyst says that's magical thinking, and I'm not saying that's what happened. I think that is a ridiculous hypothetical, but I'm just saying in an investigation you don't start with the conclusion that it came from a breach in protocol when you don't really know. And one little piece of evidence that they didn't know everything that they thought they knew is in the answer to this other question from a CNN medical producer named Caleb Hellerman. Asked David Lakey, who's the head of the Texas Health Service. That's not his actual title. I don't remember, the Texas Health Commission, something like that. But pointed out that before they said there were only 48 people who they were monitoring closely, and now they're going to look at all the healthcare workers who supposedly were wearing protective gear so they weren't at high risk. Now they're going to be monitoring them more closely, as you can see over in this clip.
If I could just quickly follow up, this woman was not in that group of 48 contacts. She was an additional person. And do you have any sense of how many more people this might expand that to?
This individual was not part of the 48, and we're looking at defining what that new number is. Working on that pretty hard right now.
Thank you.
In order to identify that number, we cast the net wide. We identify first anyone who might have had contact, and then we do detailed interviews and record reviews with each and every one of them to identify those who definitely did have contact, those who definitely didn't, and those for whom we cannot rule out that they had contact. We'll go to the next.
So, yeah, there you can see from the answer to that question that they are recalculating the pool of people who are at a higher risk because they... the people who, like this healthcare worker who has contracted Ebola, she was just on self-monitoring. She would take her own temperature twice a day, and when she first noticed a temperature, she went to the hospital immediately, and they put her in isolation, and apparently she only had one other person who was a close contact. But now they're saying that people like this healthcare worker, they should be visited by an epidemiologist. That's in a clip that I didn't show. And that's the last clip I'm going to show from the actual CDC press conference, which took place after all of the shows I'm going to show, except for CNN State of the Union with Candy Crowley. All these other shows were recorded before that CDC press conference, but one of them did have Dr. Tom Frieden, the head of the CDC, and Bob Schieffer basically asked him this, how do you know that there was a breach? And he said, we don't know what the breach is, but there was clearly a breach, which, like I said, is probably the most likely explanation, but it doesn't seem like the scientific way of looking at it. And I'll talk about that a little more after I show you that clip here.
But that the worker had been considered at that point in a low-risk situation, and they say he was following CDC protocols. In other words, wearing the gown, wearing the gloves, and all of that. Doesn't this make this even more serious than we thought it was?
We're deeply concerned about this new development with a preliminary positive in a healthcare worker who cared for the index patient in Dallas on multiple occasions after his diagnosis. I think the fact that we don't know of a breach in protocol is concerning because clearly there was a breach in protocol. We have the ability to prevent the spread of Ebola by caring safely for patients. The fact is that the individual who became ill was, as per protocol, self-monitoring. Immediately when they developed symptoms, they isolated themselves. They were promptly isolated at the hospital so that any further spread from that individual was stopped. And fundamentally at this point, there are four things that we're doing. First is to make sure that that individual is cared for safely and effectively. Second, we're identifying that individual's contacts, and our CDC team lead for this investigation on the ground in Dallas interviewed that individual in detail. Third, we now consider all of the healthcare workers who cared for the index patient potentially to have been exposed, and we'll be rostering those individuals and determining which require active follow-up in addition to their self-monitoring. And fourth, we'll conduct a full investigation of what happens before health workers go in, what happens when they're there, and what happens in taking off their protective equipment, because infections only occur when there's a breach in protocol.
All right.
So you can see even at the end, infections only occur when there's a breach in protocol. That seems like starting the investigation with a conclusion, which is by far the most likely conclusion, but it doesn't seem scientific to me to, assume that that has to be the conclusion when they don't know what the breach in protocol was. And I'm going to show a couple clips of Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's the head of, or he's from the National Institutes of Health. It's something, the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, I think is his title. It'll show up on the screen on one of these two clips. First, he was over on CNN State of the Union with Candy Crowley, and she asked him, how do we know there was a breach? And his answer is basically this same sort of circular logic that it must have been a breach because that's the only way. I'll talk about it a little more after you see it for yourself here.
Fauci, how could this happen with someone in protective gear? That's what is so alarming about this.
Well, the Candy Crowley one comes second. The first one is Martha Raddatz on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. I messed up the clip order, but they're both on the same subject. Here's the Martha Raddatz one from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos.
Fauci, how could this happen with someone in protective gear? That's what is so alarming about this.
Well, certainly there had to have been an inadvertent, innocent breach of the protocol of taking care of a patient within the personal protective equipment. That extremely rarely happens. We've been taking care of Ebola patients since 1976. Groups like Doctors Without Borders who do that almost never have an infection because of the experience of doing this. So this happened certainly because there was, and the CDC is trying to find out now just what that breach was. But this was a breach in protocol, unfortunate for this very courageous healthcare worker.
And do you know any?
So you can see Anthony Fauci making the same basic argument that Dr. Tom Frieden, and then here's the clip I was introducing before, the one where CNN's Candy Crowley basically asks even more directly, how do we know there was a breach, and gets this sort of circular logic answer that is probably correct. Like, I'm not trying to say that they're wrong, I'm just trying to say that it seems like starting the investigation with a conclusion over in this clip.
Dr. Fauci, how do they know it was a breach of protocol? We hear that she is well enough, at least at this point, for them to say, walk us through what you did. We know there were multiple contacts with the patient in isolation while she was following CDC protocol to protect herself. So, did they come to that simply because there's no other way she could have gotten it?
That is true. And we also know examples of breaches of protocol where this has happened under other circumstances. What I think the American public needs to know is that someone can go in and think they're following the protocol, and then inadvertently, particularly at the point where they're taking off the personal protective equipment, that is something that we keep emphasizing is one of the most vulnerable periods, where you're taking care of the patient, could be for an hour or more at a time. You're stressed, you're fatigued, you do everything right, and then you're getting to the point where you're going to take off the equipment. That is a vulnerable point. If it isn't done absolutely perfectly, that's how breaches occur. And in direct answer to your question, it had to have been a breach in protocol, because we know from very long experience that when protocols are very strictly followed, this does not happen.
And
is it your surmise, and it can't be anything more?
Oh, sorry there. I apologize for that. I switched to the next clip without coming to me first, because I had my mouse hovering over it. So there you see Dr. Anthony Fauci basically saying the same thing, even more clearly, that it must have been a breach because we know that when you follow the protocols, there isn't transmission. Except they haven't quite figured it out in this case. Like I said, I don't think they should be starting with that conclusion. And then another clip, one last clip on that issue I want to show is the one I just started to show by mistake there on CBS's Face the Nation. They had on their chief medical correspondent, I think is his title. It'll flash up on the screen. And his name is Dr. John LaPook. And he basically said that thinking it wasn't a breach of protocol, trying to come up with these other theories, like I said, the hypotheticals I came up with were, not something I think really happened, and they're almost ridiculous. They are ridiculous, pretty much, but just to rule them out or rule out everything but a breach of protocol at the beginning of the investigation seems wrong to me. But Dr. John LaPook in this clip calls it magical thinking to not start with that conclusion, as you can see in this clip.
Is it your surmise, and it can't be anything more at this point, that maybe what happened, this nurse took off the gloves or something, and that's how this was passed on? You don't think this means there's some new mysterious way that we didn't know about before?
No, and I know Dr. Frieden said the same thing, and this is a great time not to have magical thinking. There's 40 years of experience treating Ebola. We know how it's transmitted. There's no evidence from a huge New England Journal review a couple of weeks ago that this virus is any different than any of the previous viruses, that it's mutating or anything like that. We know that to protect the community, it's a public health measure. So the individual patient sadly died in this case, but what protects the community is the public health system, isolating the person, making sure you track down their contacts. And I have to say, after some missteps at the beginning where the apartment wasn't clean, people weren't moved out, the healthcare system did a very good job responding to this, and in fact, it took only 48 hours for the CDC to track down all 48 contacts.
We have to
Now that last part is kind of ironic because, like I said, CBS's Face the Nation that came before the CDC news conference that I showed you at the beginning of my discussion of Ebola. And you notice in the CDC news conference they don't even know how many contacts they have to track now. They're recalculating that number based on all the healthcare workers who were supposedly, following protocol and weren't going to have real contact with the patient. Now they're recalculating. They don't even know how many there are. It's not 48 anymore. So I don't know. Like I said, I think it's most likely some problem with the protocol, taking the gloves off or something like that. That does seem like the most likely explanation. I'm just questioning whether scientists should start with that conclusion at the beginning of the investigation. I want to show two more quick clips, or one's a little longer, on Ebola before I get to the final ISIS topic, where I have another 10 or so clips. The first one I want to show is also from CBS's Face the Nation. They had their reporter Debora Patta over in Monrovia, Liberia, talking about what the U.S. military is doing over there and what the situation is like. And I'll talk about that a little more after I show you that clip here.
Debora Patta is in Monrovia, Liberia, and here is her report.
The death toll from Ebola has reached 4,000, but experts here in Liberia warn that it is probably much higher, as there are still many unreported cases. Community awareness is key to halting the spread of the infection, but Western support is also crucial. Last week, another group of soldiers arrived in Monrovia. They are being deployed around the country by General Darryll Williams from an emergency operations center at a beachfront hotel ballroom. The Liberian government has welcomed the U.S. presence in Liberia, but there has also been criticism that this is too little too late.
Well, what you need to understand, Deborah, is that the government of Liberia, the ambassador's leadership, AID, the UN, CDC, a host of other non-government organizations have been here for some time dealing with this. And so we were brought in to provide our unique capability, logistics, engineering, training to fill a gap.
And in terms of filling that gap, do you think you can reverse the trend?
Yeah, so it's a whole of government approach, and we're just filling that small gap. The U.S. military is not here to solve Ebola.
The U.S. military has already set up mobile testing labs, which can cut the time down to confirm whether a sick person actually has Ebola from several days to several hours. This will free up beds a lot more quickly. A short drive away, a 150-bed U.S.-funded Ebola treatment unit is under construction. It will double the capacity to deal with the disease. But now there is a new concern. Liberian health workers are threatening a slowdown on Monday. They want danger pay and safer working conditions. The government says it is doing everything it can to resolve the dispute quickly, but aid organizations are concerned that a potential strike could severely set back Ebola containment at this critical juncture.
So I thought that was an interesting fact that I didn't hear reported on anywhere else, about how there could actually be a strike of healthcare workers in Liberia that is going to increase the spread of the epidemic there. And from what I understand, even though there's only about 7,000 known cases right now, it's still spreading at a geometric rate, meaning everyone who is diagnosed is infecting at least 2 more people, and at that rate it could go, the infection and death rate could go a lot higher before it's over. It's kind of scary. And anyway, speaking of things that hadn't been reported on any of the other channels, there's one thing about this Texas healthcare worker. There's nothing really amusing about Ebola, but one amusing fact that I didn't see reported anywhere else was reported by ABC's Tom Llamas on This Week with George Stephanopoulos, talking about Ebola. This is the last Ebola clip for the show tonight here.
Working to track down anyone who had contact with this healthcare worker. They are decontaminating their apartment, alerting neighbors, and even testing this person's pet, because the person had a pet inside of their home. We also know this healthcare worker is outside of the 48 people being treated, so that pool is now growing. Martha?
Oh, at least they are already reporting. ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos was also recorded before that CDC press conference, but at least they had the accurate information there that the pool of 48 people is growing. But I thought it was kind of amusing that they're testing the person's pet, and it's kind of sad actually. But I do the show with Sandy. The dog is back in her spot, recovered from her knee surgery during the show. So hopefully, before the end of the year, I'm going to get a new camera, and I'll be able to swivel it around and show you Sandy a little better during the show, if that ever comes up again. But that was the last clip on this Ebola outbreak. That it is kind of scary that someone who was wearing all the protective gear ended up getting the Ebola. At least there's an initial positive test. I guess the last clip I have seen was they haven't had the confirmatory test, but it's probably Ebola, I guess. Maybe by the time you're watching this show, it'll be clear about that. But it is concerning that someone who was wearing all that gear was able to get it, and you can let me know what you think about that. All those doctors, Dr. Anthony Fauci, Dr. Tom Frieden, and then Dr. John LaPook saying it's magical thinking not to start the investigation, assuming there was a breach in protocol, that the healthcare worker, had some problem putting on the gear, taking off the gear, there was some rip in the glove, or even though they don't know what the breach in protocol is, they're assuming that's what it is. I do think that's the most likely, by far the most likely explanation, but it just doesn't seem to me scientific to start the investigation with that conclusion. But you can let me know what you think. Now I have about 10 clips I want to show you on the ongoing fight with ISIS, and the first one's from CBS's Face the Nation. It's a sort of a summary report from their reporter Elizabeth Palmer. But first I'm going to show the introduction from Bob Schieffer on Face the Nation. It makes me feel a little better, already on this show I had a couple glitches where I started with the wrong clip. Well, over on Face the Nation, I guess because of the breaking news about Ebola, they recorded one segment this morning and tried to patch it in with something they recorded earlier, and you can see it didn't quite match up, as you can see in this clip that then talks about what's going on with the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria here.
Now to the other big story, the war against ISIS. CBS News correspondent Elizabeth Palmer is in Baghdad this morning with the latest on that. We'll have more on Ebola in our second half hour, including a report from Liberia, but we want to turn now to the other big story, the war against ISIS. CBS News correspondent Elizabeth Palmer is in Baghdad with the latest on that.
ISIS is now on the attack in a kind of half circle around Baghdad, from the north around to the west and down to the south. At the closest point, their fighters are in an outer suburb called Abu Ghraib, which is about 8 miles from the perimeter of Baghdad International Airport. There are now 12 teams of American military advisors on the ground with the Iraqi forces who are charged with protecting the capital. And America is also carrying out airstrikes nearby, mainly to the west and to the south. Now, nobody expects a major assault on the city anytime soon, but it's likely ISIS will keep up the pressure with a bombing campaign by slipping through the many army and police checkpoints in the city, and even civilian security checks that have been set up in all public places, including in mosques. In fact, yesterday, more than 30 people were killed in 3 separate bomb attacks. Now, outside the city, ISIS is in control of some major sections of highway and also key towns. The Iraqi security forces fighting them are holding their own, but only just. There have certainly been no major victories in the past few days.
So yeah, the situation, even though these airstrikes have been, U.S. airstrikes have been going on for something like 9 weeks now, it seems like ISIS is not being contained and is threatening Baghdad. And I'm going to show a clip a little later from ABC where it looks like the use of U.S. Apache helicopters was all that stood between ISIS and Baghdad airport sometime in the last week or so. And but first I want to show another summary of how tough things are going for the U.S. campaign against ISIS, this time from NBC's Chuck Todd. And this is kind of another glitch. He has like a little breathing problem in his introduction to his pre-recorded report here, and you can also kind of tell about 30 seconds in that after he has the breathing problem that he's reading something, but not to be nitpicky, sorry, over in this clip.
One against ISIS, and that one, no one thought it was going to be easy, but it's becoming increasingly clear that a brutal and lengthy campaign is just beginning. And with ISIS continuing to make gains despite U.S. airstrikes, many are asking whether the war can be won without a significant commitment of ground troops by the U.S. or key allies like Turkey. The first American bombs hit ISIS on August 8th. Now, 65 days later, the United States and allies have launched more than 400 airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. And the goal?
We will degrade and ultimately destroy
ISIL.
But there are serious doubts now about the strategy as ISIS continues its advance.
Tonight, another key city is on the brink of falling.
The extremist group is now threatening to take the key city of Kobani near the Turkish border. Turkish troops have been sitting on the other side, watching, but not fighting. The United Nations says thousands could be massacred if Kobani falls. And now there are reports that ISIS is focusing on Baghdad. The overall issue, the U.S. underestimated ISIS and overestimated our allies.
Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria.
And as ISIS continues to gain ground, American air power is only able to do so much. I want to go to...
So there you can see Richard Engle, Chuck Todd talking about the problems that the United States campaign is running into in Iraq and Syria, and how ISIS has made gains both on the Turkish border and near Baghdad. And NBC also had a couple reports from Richard Engle over in Iraq, also talking about how ISIS is making this resurgence. First, talking about how the airstrikes how ISIS had moved over to northern Iraq by where the Kurds are, and now is refocusing on Baghdad, and hasn't really been deterred by the airstrikes over in this clip.
They do not seem to be degraded at all. At first, ISIS was moving toward Baghdad when this crisis began earlier this summer. Then they shifted gears, moved to where I am. They started to attack Kurdistan. The bombing campaign began, and now ISIS is once again focused on Baghdad. So it is having an impact in that it has forced ISIS to change their targets somewhat, but it is certainly not slowing down the group.
So that's the first clip from Richard Engle, where he says that we're not really degrading ISIS. And if you weren't clear from that clip that he was criticizing President Obama's policy, in the next clip he specifically says that there are big contradictions in the policy because there are these airstrikes, but there aren't the ground troops to back them up, basically, over in this clip.
There are enormous contradictions in the U.S. strategy that are becoming more apparent every day. Let's start with Iraq. Even though this is really one conflict that has no border between it, we are artificially putting this border between Iraq and Syria because ISIS is on both sides. But let's start with Iraq. The Iraqi army is in no better shape now than it was when it collapsed. The new Iraqi government is not instilling confidence in the people. It is not instilling confidence in the armed forces. The U.S. spent years and years and billions of dollars to build the Iraqi army, only to watch it collapse and hand over so many of its weapons. So it is completely unrealistic to think that now, with a little bit of outside help and a lot of American goodwill, that the army is going to fundamentally change, and the Iraqi government, which is really just a reshuffle of the same characters, is going to fundamentally change and suddenly inspire the Iraqi people to be behind it. On the other side, in Syria, there are no allies on the ground. There are some Kurdish militias, but we're not even fully backing them. We're not consistently backing them.
So that was the Richard Engle really saying that there are these big contradictions in Obama's policy, and that one about the use of the combat troops being necessary because Iraqi forces are no longer are not any better than they were before the U.S. started this campaign, and that the new Iraqi government is just reshuffling. You'll see that Obama's National Security Advisor Susan Rice is going to try to refute that, but I don't think in a very convincing way, a little later on Meet the Press when she's talking to Chuck Todd. But I want to show a couple clips in between. First, they had Henry Kissinger on talking to Tom Brokaw in a segment before Susan Rice came on, and he said something interesting about Iran, and there'll be a clip I'm going to show from Susan Rice about Iran. So this is Henry Kissinger saying that Iran is actually a natural ally of the United States, and I don't know, in a way it could be true if you think about it from long historical perspective. He says that the religious extremists, of course, make that impossible, but other than that, how was the play, Mrs. Lincoln, I guess, but you can see that clip right here.
Secretary Baker raises the possibility of Iran becoming more involved. Our closest ally in the Middle East is Israel, obviously, and Bibi Netanyahu does not pass up an opportunity to declare Iran the kind of evil empire. He's terrified about their nuclear capacity.
As long as Iran is ruled by the Ayatollahs and bases itself on a sectarian philosophy, we have to be careful. But basically, as a country, Iran is a natural ally of the United States. It's the ideological, religious component that makes it an antagonist.
But
And, you know, I made fun of that a little bit before I introduced the clip, but I think there is some truth in that, especially amongst the population in Iran. I've seen some reports, some like underground reporters in Iran, that especially the young people in Iran are not extremist Muslims and are actually kind of pro-American and pro-pop culture, you know, American pop culture. And that's one of the things about Iran, is that it's been so long since their government was, you know, a dictator propped up by the United States, that they don't have the animosity against the United States as some of these countries where they're ruled by dictators who are still propped up by the United States. So I think it's actually an interesting example of how the people of the country don't necessarily reflect their government in terms of being, you know, Iran is a great example of a country where the government is imposing Islamic precepts that I disagree with and would be happy to criticize, going back to the Islam issue. But there are a lot of people who call themselves Muslim in Iran who actually aren't religious extremists, especially these young people that I've seen reports on from underground reporters who like go to raves and listen to pop music and, you know, actually admire Western liberal values. So that's one point I want to make. And the next clip I want to show is actually an interesting clip where Susan Rice, where Chuck Todd asked Susan Rice about that issue of Iran, and gets an answer where she says no, but it means yes, because Chuck Todd is saying, is it true that Iran is helping the fight against ISIS? And she says no, but then she says Iran isn't, we aren't collaborating or coordinating with Iran, but they might be helping because they might be helping the Iraqi government. So it's like a no means yes answer over in this clip.
Chuck.
Let me just start to get your reaction to something that Secretary Baker said in that piece, which is he thinks Iran needs to be part of this coalition of sorts. He didn't quite say part of the actual coalition, but needs to be part of this fight against ISIS. And he also hinted, he said, I wouldn't be surprised if they already were providing some help. Are they?
No. We are not
under
in
any circumstance.
We're not in coordination or direct consultation with the Iranians about any aspect of the fight against ISIL. It is a fact that in Iraq, they also are supporting the Iraqis against ISIL, but we are not coordinating. We're doing this very differently and independently. Our coalition is comprised of some 60 countries, all of our core allies in the Gulf region of the Arab world, most of our NATO partners, many of our traditional partners from outside, including Australia. It's a very broad-based, very comprehensive coalition that has come together to deal with the threat from ISIL. And it's gratifying that countries from all over the world share the same perception of the threat that ISIL poses. And Iran may or may not be among those, but they're not a part of our coalition.
But do you want to be engaging Iran or not?
Well, we are engaging Iran on the
on a
nuclear
separate issue. I understand that, but on this,
we
you
have
just don't
had
think
some,
it can be done.
We've had some informal consultations on the margins of the nuclear talks about certain regional issues, but there's no coordination, there's no collaboration on the anti-ISIL campaign.
So, like I said, I think that was a no means yes answer, where there's no coordination or collaboration, but yes, Iran is helping in the fight against ISIS, and it sounds like there was even some communication about regional issues. So even though there isn't coordination or collaboration, there's probably some communication going on with Iran, and they are helping out in some way in the fight against ISIS. I want to show another clip from Susan Rice talking to Chuck Todd, where she was really adamant that there aren't going to be U.S. combat troops in Iraq, that we're not going to refight that war, and it's all about building up the Iraqi forces over time. And like I said, this is sort of a refutation or a response to what Richard Engle was saying before about how the reshuffled Iraqi government isn't inspiring confidence in the troops yet, but it's too early to tell, according to Susan Rice, as you can see over in this clip.
So no, there has been no recommendation from
No
the
official
American
ask.
military commanders, either on the ground or here in Washington, that the United States put any ground combat forces into Iraq. That has not come up the chain to anybody at the White House. And I don't anticipate that it will, Chuck. I mean, let's be clear here. The President has been very plain that this is not a campaign that requires or even would benefit from American ground troops in combat again. The Iraqi Prime Minister, the government of Iraq have said very plainly they don't want American troops in combat. We are there to help build up the Iraqi capacity to sustain their territory and to hold the
implication here is that
ground.
the Iraqi troops aren't working.
Well, it's early days, Chuck. As I said, they've atrophied over the years because Maliki, the former prime minister, governed in a very sectarian way, turned the Iraqi army into an army for part of Iraq rather than all of Iraq, and then has squandered equipment and training. We have a long way to go with the new Iraqi government to build back that capacity. But let's be clear. We experienced during the course of our 10-year military commitment in Iraq that once we leave, and eventually we all will and have to leave, that if the Iraqis aren't willing and committed and able to sustain those gains, then they will be fleeting. So this time we're doing it differently. The Iraqis have to be in the lead. They have to have the capacity and the will to hold territory against ISIL on their own. Well, then first and foremost, they're going to be threatened. But that's why we have placed such a premium, Chuck, on taking the time to build this capacity. It's not going to happen overnight, but if it isn't achieved, nothing is going to be sustainable. So people need to understand there are going to be good days, bad days, victories and setbacks as the Iraqis themselves take this fight to ISIL.
Let's go to Turkey.
So yeah, there you can see National Security Advisor Susan Rice being pretty clear that there aren't going to be ground troops and that it's a matter of building up the local forces to be able to take advantage of U.S. airstrikes. And hopefully that's true. I mean, I'm not a big proponent of the airstrikes themselves, but I am kind of worried, very worried that the people in there, that there's not that much of a difference between the forces that are in there and ground combat troops. Some of them are in combat roles, and I'm going to show a clip on that in just a minute from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. But first I want to show one more Susan Rice clip where Chuck Todd just confronts her with the attitude you saw from the beginning of Meet the Press, where Richard Engle was saying that ISIL isn't really being degraded. So asking Susan Rice if the Obama administration is reassessing the strategy and gets like it's early days, we have to wait and see answer that you can see in this clip.
Right now, are you reassessing the strategy or no?
No, Chuck, this is very early days of the strategy. The strategy is very clear. We'll do what we can from the air. We will support the Iraqi security forces, the Kurds, and ultimately, over time, the moderate opposition in Syria to be able to control territory and take the fight to ISIL. We'll do our part from the air and in many other respects in terms of building up the capacity of the Iraqis and the Syrian opposition, the moderates. But we are not going to be in a ground war again in Iraq. It's not what is required by the circumstances that we face. And even if one were to take that step, which the president has made clear we're not going to do, it wouldn't be sustainable. We got to do this in a sustainable way.
So there you again have assurances from President Obama's National Security Advisor. We are not going to put ground troops, combat troops in Iraq. But this next clip I'm going to show you from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, Martha Raddatz interviewed the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, and the most interesting clip of all, she got him to confirm that we use these Apache helicopters, which are not like aircraft that go way up in the air, as you'll see in her introduction to the question to Martin Dempsey. They're pretty close to the ground and pretty vulnerable, and we used U.S. Apache helicopters to stop ISIS from taking over Baghdad airport. They were basically the only thing between ISIS and Baghdad airport, as you can see over in this clip.
Most critical right now, keeping the Baghdad airport out of the hands of ISIS. The chairman revealing a recent fierce battle near there between ISIS and Iraqi forces, where for the first time the U.S. had to call in Apache attack helicopters to prevent the Iraqi forces from being overrun. Those helicopters fly low and at a much greater risk than fighter jets.
The tool that was immediately available was the Apache. The risk of operating in a hostile environment is there constantly.
That was right by the airport?
Well, this is a case where you're not going to wait till they're climbing over the wall. They were within, 20 or 25 kilometers where...
Of Baghdad airport.
Sure. And had they overrun the Iraqi unit, it was a straight shot to the airport. So we're not going to allow that to happen. We need that airport.
So that was kind of interesting. The 2 Apache helicopters were the only thing between ISIS, overrunning this one Iraqi unit and going all the way to Baghdad airport. That's a little concerning in terms of the security situation. And then I also want to show another clip from Martha Raddatz interviewing Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Martin Dempsey, where she follows up on something she reported from that aircraft carrier a couple weeks back about how a lot of the U.S. airplanes are going out and coming back with their bombs because there aren't enough ISIS targets anymore. She says actually 10%, and you can see Martin Dempsey's response to that over in this clip.
Meanwhile, since the bombing campaign began, ISIS has been changing tactics, making targets harder to identify, with reports that only 10% of warplanes are actually dropping bombs.
Is it harder to find targets? Is that an accurate figure?
Yeah, I don't know if that's the right percentage precisely, but that wouldn't surprise me if that's the right number, and the enemy adapts, and they'll be harder to target. Yeah, they know how to maneuver and how to use populations and concealment. And so when we get a target, we'll take it.
So I thought that was an interesting follow-up. I discussed a couple weeks ago when Martha Raddatz was on the aircraft carrier about whether her closeness to the military was a positive thing because she got this great access and good information that I think you saw in those last 2 clips, but then she also gave them some venue for pro-military propaganda, and you can sort of see that in this next clip, final clip of the Martin Dempsey interview, where she sort of tees up a question about what's it like to live under the rule of ISIS, and you can see him both talking about the savagery of ISIS, but then trying to talk about how they're crafty and being nice to the people sometimes too, over in this clip.
Right now.
What is it like inside Mosul and Fallujah, where ISIS controls those areas?
Extraordinarily strict interpretations of Sharia law, punishments, crucifixions and beheadings of a nature that the world hasn't seen in hundreds of years. Yeah, but ISIL is also clever to give the enemy its due. They are also providing basic goods and services. They seek to reach out to children, to influence the next generation.
It was, of course.
So, I don't know what you think about General Martin Dempsey's assessment of the rule of ISIS in that clip, whether it's too negative or too positive, or what the mixture was there. But I just thought I would show that one. And then the last clip I want to show it's not particularly about ISIS, but it's the Leon Panetta interview over on CBS's Face the Nation. Leon Panetta used to be head of the CIA and defense secretary, and he's come out with this book where he's pretty critical of Obama's strategy in the Middle East and not arming the Syrian rebels earlier and not leaving a residual force in Iraq. And he answered this question from Bob Schieffer about whether Obama is too much like a law professor, with this answer that almost made me think that he thinks that Obama isn't a Klingon warrior almost. He doesn't use the word Klingon, but he does use the word warrior, as you can see in the final clip for the show tonight here.
In the book that sometimes he doesn't seem to show the passion that one needs to show, that he approaches things as a law professor.
I don't mind presidents
who have the quality of a law professor and looking at the issues and determining just exactly, what needs to be done. But presidents need to also have the heart of a warrior. That's the way you get things done, is you engage in the fight. And in this town, as difficult as it is, and it is difficult. I mean, you've got Tea Party members in Congress who basically want to shut the government down and tear it down. He still has to have the ability to engage and to try to work with people up there who want to get things done in order to make sure that we just don't stalemate as a country. This country is strong, it's powerful. I think we could have a great future. But if all we do is operate by crisis after crisis after crisis, then we are going to weaken this country.
Now, I'm not sure the president should have the heart of a warrior. I think being more professorial, I don't know, maybe it's my personal bias, but anyway, that's the final clip I want to show for tonight. Before I finish up, I want to thank all of you who donated with the support button. I think you can actually, up in the upper left-hand corner, there's a little eye that if you want to, you can donate to support the Liberal Viewer channel, and there's also a support button on my actual channel. Because I got almost enough support to put myself to making minimum wage for the effort I put in on the show every Sunday, I'm only going to put the commercials in every half hour instead of every 15 minutes, and if I keep getting those donations, then maybe I can just start with one commercial at the beginning and then the rest ad-free. That would be kind of nice. I'd like to not have to figure out where to put all those ads in. So thanks to you, to all of you who donated last week, and I hope you enjoyed the clips I picked out for you. They ended your weekend or started your week a little more informed about at least what the corporate media here in the United States thinks is important. I appreciated about 60 of you joined me along the way. I've been reading your comments. Because I started late, I'm way over time, so I don't really have time to go and discuss with you what you've been posting, but thanks for keeping me company while I showed you the clips I picked out. And I'll be doing the show hopefully on time next week, starting at 6:30 p.m. Pacific time every Sunday. Liberal Viewer Sunday live clip roundup. Thanks again for joining me, and I'll be seeing you all around the internet.